Okay.
Hi, I am Laura Flanders of Grit TV, and I want to welcome everybody to today's very special event. We are here marking the national launch of the Next System project. What's the Next System project about? Well, let me tell you some of the things it's not about. It's not about the same old conversation. We've all heard the conversation about what crashed the financial system, what might revive the financial system, the pros and cons of austerity and stimulus, and austerity for whom and stimulus for whom else. We've all talked about the mysteriously warming world in which we live, one in which we're encouraged to care but not do very much. And all this warming is taking place also within the context of war. We've all been in those conversations too about which issue is most important, which issue is the priority. Is it economics? Is it environment? Is it policing, education, health, or war? Well, this conversation is about systemic thinking. It's about pulling together a bigger picture of what's going on and what needs to change as a whole. And it's about beginning, not ending a conversation. So that's what's bringing us here today. And I want you to know before we even begin or go any further that there is a very large group of organizations that have made today's webinar possible. The list of co-sponsors can be found at the website, but let's just say among those co-sponsors is the Institute for Policy Studies, the New Economy Working Group, the New Economy Coalition, Pando Populous, Donella Meadows Institute, the Capital Institute, MIT CoLab, Public Banking Institute, Pennsylvania Public Bank Project, World Ocean Observatory, Bali, Code Pink, Roots Action, Lyft, Demos, Roosevelt Institute Campus Network, the Schumacher Center for a New Economics, PolicyLink, World Beyond War, Gross National Happiness USA, National People's Action, Economics for Equity and Environment, and Grit TV. That said, we have some very special speakers, and the way that today's webinar is going to go is we're going to hear from each of them in brief. We will get a chance to return to each of them to elaborate somewhat on what they have to say, and then we're going to have some opportunity for you to for the group to talk, and then for you who are watching or listening online to contribute your questions. I do not promise we'll get to them all, but we'll get to them as many as we can. The best way for you to contribute your question if you're watching this webinar is to tweet that question with the hashtag what's next. Hashtag what's next. And for anyone who is unclear about what is the follow-up for today's conversation, we'll make that very clear in the course of this next hour. So let me introduce, to kick things off, our co-hosts, as it were, the co-authors of the report that we are celebrating today, the Next System Project report. Alperovitz is the former Lionel Bauman Professor of Political Economy at the University of Maryland and co-founder of the Democracy Collaborative. Speth joined the faculty of the Vermont Law School as a professor of law in 2010 and serves as Distinguished Fellow at Demos, as well as an Associate Fellow at the Telos Institute. He's also co-chair of the Next System Project. Let's start with you, Gar. The Next System Project, what is it? Why is it?
Well, first I want to thank you, Laura, for joining us today, and I want to thank IPS for hosting the Washington part of this. The Next System Project attempts to focus on something that we all understand, but the long trends that are going on in the economy. Gus will probably talk more about the environmental side, but you know, most average workers have not seen more than 75 cents total increase in their pay per hour over 30 years. I didn't say 75 cents each year, I said over 30 years. When long trends like that don't move, you know something deeper in the institution structure is going on. So let me put it another way. Over 30 years in this case, and we'll talk about more, you've had Republicans, you've had Democrats, you've had Republicans and Democrats, and politics doesn't touch the trend. Unfortunately, that's true in many other areas. Corporate profits have gone up, but corporate taxation has gone down from about 9% of the GDP to under 3% over that time span. What's also gone up is incarceration rates. We've increased to about 700 per 100,000. That's about 8 times higher than most countries, including Russia, going up as these go down, and the elections don't touch it much. So we could go on in that vein, but when you know that that's happening, it's time to talk about what's driving this. And I think what people are beginning to realize is that a systemic problem is kind of anchored and based in the nature of the big institutions, the corporations, for instance, that are driving it. The military, that somehow we keep getting into war again and again and again, even though the cost of the war and the results are obviously going the other way. So when you talk about the notion of the Next System Project is simply to say what people understand already. Something really is going on here that's much deeper. And secondly, once to get that out, and politics is still important and organizing is important, but once to put on the table that we face a deep crisis of the system, then to begin looking around the country and elsewhere in theory in other countries to what kinds of systems might produce something beyond corporate capitalism, beyond state socialism. There's got to be a new way forward that we can build from pragmatic things, build from theory, build from other examples, and begin talking at that level even as we go forward, holding the line, producing whatever we can do in politics and organizing. Our goal is to put that on the table and work with lots of folks who want to join that conversation, do the research, do the discussions, and begin opening up a larger, longer-term vision. We've done that before in America. Things have come from the women's movement, the civil rights movement, the environmental movement, many other times, starting at where we have to start and then building up over time. That's the goal, to begin building a system that might actually work and produce the outcomes we hope for.
Thanks, Gar. Gus, as Gar said, you come to this work with 40 years of research into questions having to do with the environment. Why has that work led you to this place, or how has it, perhaps?
Well, I remember walking around, Laura, on the mall in 1970 at the first Earth Day, and I've been in this field ever since. And it took me a long time to come to the following conclusion. We have many victories in the environmental area. The groups rack up accomplishments all the time. And yet when we look at the big trends, we see that we're still losing. We're losing biodiversity, we're losing forest, we're losing soils, we're losing water, and the climate is going haywire on us. And when you have all these problems persist, despite the fact that our groups have grown in strength and sophistication, I think you have to conclude, and I certainly have, that really we're trying to make progress within a system which is failing us. The system, we work within the system, but the system doesn't work for us. And so my conclusion after these 40-some odd years is that we've simply got to change the system. We've got to drive deep systemic change through a series of measures that really do transform the system away from this rapacious, ruthless capitalism that we have today, and not back to statist socialism, but to something new that we will invent, a new system of political economy that really does give top priority to people and to place and to planet, honest priority. And that's why I was so pleased and delighted when one of my heroes, Alperovitz, asked me to co-chair this effort with him, because I really think that there's nothing more important that we can be doing now than opening up this question of system change, of communicating among ourselves and with a larger and larger group that there are alternatives to the current system. It's not what Margaret Thatcher said when she said there's no alternative. There are alternatives. We need to explore them, develop them, help them come alive on the ground. And that's the great thing in our country today, is what so many of our communities are doing, bringing the future into the present, into everyday life. And that's an encouragement, it's an example. And when the crises come again, as they surely will, people will not only, I hope, have a sense that this is a system crisis, they'll also be able to look across the landscape and see the right things being done and be inspired by them.
Thanks, Gus. No communities, I think, have done more to bring this information to us, bring these challenges to us, and some of the answers to us than our frontline communities in this country and the world, especially communities of color. Angela Glover Blackwell is founder and chief executive officer of PolicyLink. You've been looking at these questions for many years also. Bring us your first take of what this next new system project can be about.
I'll tell you what I think it must be about, and thank you for the webinar and this opportunity to have honest conversation about the systemic change that we need to be able to find a way forward that is sustainable, fair, and just. We really are at an amazing moment in our history where the unfairness in our economic system is on everybody's tongue. And it's touching not just low-income people of color, it's touching everybody. We've been hearing a lot about inequality, but we haven't been talking enough about toxic inequality. We're experiencing toxic inequality that is hollowing out the middle class, baking in persistent poverty, cutting off paths to mobility, and cutting off the prospects for the current and future generations. This toxic inequality is really touching all Americans, particularly those who are middle class, lower middle class, struggling to stay in the middle class. And yet they seem unable to identify how to deal with their plight because they keep getting caught up as powerful forces fan racial anxiety and foster fear. What we need to understand is that the new system, whatever it is, has got to tackle racism head on. Because we are becoming a nation which the majority will be people of color very soon, in 4 short years. The majority of all children in this country, 18 and under, will be of color. By 2030, the majority of the young workforce will be of color. By 2042, 43, 44, somewhere in there, the majority of all people in this country will be of color. And it's people who are Black, many Asians, Native Americans, many Latinos are being disproportionately left behind without the resources to be fully contributing. We know that the nation is in peril. And so as we think about a new system, we have to remind ourselves that we have had better systems in the past that did not achieve what we needed to achieve for full inclusion because of racism. And while racism has changed over time, we are feeling the impact of its legacy as well as its current existence. And so the need for a new system is more urgent than ever, because if we don't get a system of inclusion in place, the nation will suffer. It is needed, and we have to talk about it in a way that people can see beyond their usual responses, because we have to fundamentally challenge the system, and we have to challenge the racism that predates the forming of the country and is keeping the country from having any shot at reaching its full potential right now. So I embrace the exercise. I feel the urgency, but we have to be able to put together a system that not only challenges our economic assumptions, but challenges our assumptions about who is worthy, how have we messed up in the past in terms of not appreciating the contributions that have to be made from all, and really this time get it right, not just theoretically, but in practice.
Thank you so much, Angela. I just want to remind people, if you have questions you want to pose to this webinar, tweet them to us with the hashtag #What'sNext. Let me go to Julie Schor. Julie is a professor of sociology at Boston College and author of The Overworked American, The Unexpected Decline of Leisure, and many more. The Overworked American, The Overspent American, also Plenitude, The New Economics of True Wealth. She's a co-founder and co-chair of the board of the Center for a New American Dream. And I want to ask you, Julie, to weigh in here based on your research. What makes you think this is the moment for this conversation, or rather that this is a moment that could produce something new?
Great. Well, thank you, Laura, and thanks to all the panelists and to Gar and Gus for getting this really exciting project going. I think that there's a widespread understanding that the system we have isn't working, but as a student of economic history, one of the things I know is that it takes more than a crisis of an old system to get a new one. And so one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, why is it credible now to think that we could get a new one? What's different? What's special about this moment? Why are we optimistic about the possibilities? Now, the old system, I would say, has a couple of features that are no longer viable as conditions for organizing an economy and a society. So the first, I think, is probably the best well-known. That's the indiscriminate and unsustainable use of natural resources. In the old system, natural resources are free. Corporations are free to pollute the atmosphere, for example, which has given us global warming. So that's the first one. The second one is that the right way to organize an economy is through competition versus a more cooperative kind of structure. And the third is the idea that by centralizing control, particularly over capital and land, that is over productive resources, that centralization of control gets us a good and efficient system. Now, those are the principles on which the old system was based. They came about largely in the 19th century, and they have yielded, at the current moment, a really disastrous situation. We are on a path to ecocide if we don't do something about it. What's really exciting now, I think, is that none of those three conditions are supported any longer, and there are reasons to think that we can transform those to make a system that is fair, that is not based on racism like the old colonial system has been, that is efficient, that is sustainable. So why is that? And there are really three things. One is that we see what's happening with natural resources. We're starting to grope toward a way of using them more sustainably. But the second piece of the puzzle, I think, is much less well recognized, and that is that the possibilities for cooperation, and in particular the role that new technologies play, in creating networks of cooperation and distributed power rather than competitive centralized power. And we now have new technologies that are a really fundamentally strong basis for creating principles of a new system. And I'll talk more about those later in the hour, but that's what I'm thinking about right now.
Thanks, Julie. So we may have new technology, but we have some of the same old challenges. And I think the biggest challenge that I hear mentioned from people is the political challenge. How do we make any of this change that we're talking about viable politically, which is to say, how do we accomplish it in the real world? I'd like to bring Gerald Torres on to talk about that. He is currently the Jane M.G. Foster Professor of Law at Cornell, and he's a leading figure in critical race theory, environmental law, and federal Indian law. How do we ever affect this change, Gerald?
Well, that's obviously the big question. One of the things I've been working on for the last few years is how social movements affect legal change, and how social movements put together are constructed, and how they produce the background elements necessary to make arguments, at least for lawyers, that were implausible at one point become plausible, so that lawyers who are a conservative bunch by nature accept them as plausible arguments, and for judges who are conservative by nature to accept them as plausible arguments, but also to accept them as a way to organize. And one of the things that I've done over the course of the last 15 years in the groups that I've been working with is to recognize that there's a lot of things happening at the grassroots level that happen really below the radar. So if you saw what happened in LA just yesterday or a couple of days ago, the raising of the minimum wage, and you read the article, first of all, there's a lot of organization that had to happen to make that possible. that's just one bit of effort that's happening across the country to challenge the structure, the wage structure that is part of the immiseration of a lot of working people across the country. But one of the factoids when you read the articles is that 46% of the people in Los Angeles were already working at below the minimum wage. So that just getting people up to the minimum wage for in Los Angeles represents an incredible change, an incredible challenge to get that passed. So that required a lot of organization. If you look at the events, you look at the things in Ferguson and Baltimore and New York, and you can look at those as episodes of police and brutality and police overreaching and police episodes of police enforcing the policies against the black community, or you can look at it as the one expression of the state exercising its force against civil society in a way that gets expressed the way it was traditionally expressed, against the least powerful. So that one of the metaphors that my co-author Guinea and I have used again and again is the metaphor of the miner's canary. And so what you want to do is you want to look at those segments of society that for which institutions aren't working, because those are the places where you're going to find political constituencies that may not think of themselves as aligned, but actually do have interests in common. And the institutions that aren't working for, say, black people, the chances are good they're not working for other people as well. And those are where the natural constituencies, that natural allies are going to be found. And what we've got to find is a way to bridge those links, link those fates together, and produce the constituencies that are going to demand change. We've done that in the environmental movement, in the production of the environmental justice movement, and Gus knows that's produced a transformation in some aspects of the way in which the environmental movement now conceives of its mission. We know that in terms of policing, what the Advancement Project has done in the schoolhouse to jailhouse, in the urban peace movement, in the transformation in some cities, and even in the way in which we're trying to address the linkage between our international actions and the impact that has on urban peace in this country. We've got to figure out who our allies are and pull up the ideas that are happening across the country and say, it's not just the people at the top who have ideas, it's the people at the bottom, and we've got to listen to those ideas and bring them, give them the structure, give them the political resonance, and build a theoretical basis, and build those linkages. And that's, I think, what has to happen. And we've got to build networks to link those fates together.
Thank you, Gerald. Maybe your connection is breaking up a little bit. Maybe there's some way we can improve it. But I think you've hit on the next stage of this conversation, for which I want to come back first off to Gar, which is to describe a little bit of the scene out there. We recently on the show had Stacy Mitchell from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance and Esteban Kelly from the U.S. Federation of Worker-Owned Cooperatives, and asked them, like, what's the state of this new economy movement? Can we say there is a new economy movement? What's your answer to that? What do you see out there, Gar?
Well, let me preface it by saying I wear a historian's hat as well as a political economist's hat. And if you look at the way in which people sometimes think, how can you change the system? But if you look at the way movements build up over 5, 10, 20, 30 years, what you see is developments at the beginning. People say, that's just beginning stuff. What does it matter? But then a few years later, you see other people building on that because the pain levels of the society are generating the need for new answers. And you really do see it in connection with changing who owns wealth. The concentration of wealth in the United States and it leads you to the co-op question immediately. The top 400 people, you could get them in an easy, most classrooms that you can squeeze them in, or a church, small church, have more wealth than the bottom 180 million people taken together. That's part of the power structure that's holding this thing together. Well, the alternative is to begin democratizing wealth. And what you've begun to see over the last 5 years particularly is people saying it's time to have worker ownership of cooperative. There are about 400 or 500 of them now around the country, some of them extremely complex, some of them just beginning, but the trend is up. There's one in Cleveland that many people probably have heard about that is a complex of worker-owned companies, significant scale. One of them is the largest greenhouse in the Midwest, produces something like 3 million heads of lettuce a year, not small change issues. Some of it supported in a way that builds the community as well as worker co-ops. There's a new era window co-op, workers co-op in Chicago that's developed. There are very important groups that are working with household workers, that are working around the country in different ways. It's an expanding, developing field, partly because people need the jobs and need the ownership, partly because there's no way else to go, and partly because an idea is beginning to give people a sense of direction. If you look at what happened in the years before the New Deal, almost all of what became national programs were developed first at the state and local level experimentally, and I think that's one way of thinking about how you change the system. The pain levels are creating new opportunities, and people are beginning to experiment in positive ways that are beginning to build over time.
And you, Gus, are there particular kind of grassroots shoots that you look at that give you a sense that there's something here that can be built on?
Well, one thing that excites me a lot now is development that I think offers the potential to bring the environmental community and the civil rights community together in a way that we haven't seen in the past. Jerry mentioned the need for powerful social movements, and Angela spoke to social justice. And perhaps I'm entering my anecdotage in my mid-70s here, but I want to reflect a minute to go back to really the origins of the modern civil rights environmental movement, excuse me. And if we do that, we see two important things. One is that there was a real radicalism at the roots of the environmental movement. We had people challenging growth fetish, challenging consumerism and materialism, challenging the system of national accounts and GDP, challenging growth, and really calling for deep change to a new system. People like Barry Commoner and his bestseller, The Closing Circle. And, well, we sort of left that behind as we went inside the Beltway to try to implement the new laws. The other big thing that was going on back then was if I reflect on what I was inspired by to get into the environmental movement, and many, many others were inspired by, it was the black community in America and their civil rights activism and the laws that were passed and the litigation that was brought forward and won. I mean, that was our inspiration when I was in college and law school during the 60s. And the great tragedy is that when we started up this modern environmental movement, we kind of left those connections behind. We didn't really reach out to the civil rights community, to the black community in America. And what's happening now, in my case and many others, we're advocating a return to these radical roots in the environmental movement. And what I've seen lately in books like Cornell West's The Radical King, and Glenda Gilmore's book, Defying Dixie, The Radical Roots of Civil Rights, is that a lot of black leaders in the country and civil rights advocates in the country are saying we need to the radical roots of this movement. And if you look at what is being said in both cases as to what the problem is, when you look at this deep critique, it's the same critique. Cornell West is making the same critique of the system. And I think it was, Martin Luther King said, the whole edifice needs restructuring. And we're seeing this this system problem at the root of both the problems in our environmental community and in the black communities and minority communities of our country. And this is great hope. This really means something, because now we have a basis for a common platform, for a common dialogue, a common agenda, and a fusion of forces coming together in the environmental area and in the civil rights of the black community.
Let me bring Angela in on this. Thank you. Let me bring Angela in on this. I mean, we were just recently for the show in Baltimore, and sure enough, just as Gus said, there wasn't a person that didn't connect violence by police to much more systemic questions, particularly the violence of the economy. Can you describe how those connections are being made? And is it, as Dr. King said, also inclusive of the war machine, militarism? Dr. King talked about the three evils: poverty, militarism, and materialism, I think, if I have it right. Let's bring up Angela. Angela, is your mic on?
It was not, sorry.
Gotcha.
Clearly they are connected, and it's obvious that they're connected. What we're not doing is committing to focus on all of the issues that have to be addressed to make a lasting difference. It's easy to talk about the connection, that when you look at Baltimore and Ferguson and Cleveland, and I could bring in many other cities that haven't had an uprising, but clearly they could, you can tell that people are living in communities that have suffered from long-term disinvestment. You can tell that people have suffered under systems that are failing to educate children. You can tell that people are isolated from work because of the transformation that's taken place in our economic system, the jobs that are available that weren't available before, jobs that were available before that are not available now. But this is going to take a long time, a lot of money, and a complete restructuring. And we just have to face that. That the tax system needs to lead with equity and inclusion, the education system, the healthcare system, the development that happens in communities. But sadly, what we have, and Gar spoke to it, is powerful elites have captured the mechanisms of government and of the marketplace, and they're serving them, they're not serving the people. So that when you ask about the interconnectedness, of course the interconnectedness is there, but it's been there all along. I am inspired that people want to talk about these issues again, but the conversation has not yet gotten new. I think that when you talk about the radical roots of the civil rights movement, you really have to separate the gains from the civil rights movement from the passion that went into it. The passion was radical. The gains were not. The gains actually led us to being able to open up opportunity within a system that was already rigged, that wasn't going to get to the full inclusion that we needed. So we've got to get back to really being willing to speak out about everything that is wrong. What that means is we have to have a system that routinely, that at scale, that always is focused on growing good jobs. Some of it is what Gar talked about. Some of it is raising the bottom. Some of it is making sure that people who want to work can work and work with dignity. But we also have to invest in really building the capabilities that people need. That means we need a complete restructuring of the way that we think about education, the way we think about community. And we have to remove barriers in terms of incarceration and so many other things that we're talking about. But removing barriers is not the same thing as creating pathways to opportunity. Really investing in what we know works, when we take a geographic area and we commit to making sure everybody in that area is able to thrive, that's going to take a lot. Yes, this is a moment when we should connect the dots, and we need to do more than do it rhetorically. We have to make sure the systems are connecting those dots and creating some pathways forward.
Gerald, do you want to come in on this?
Well, I mean, I think I absolutely agree with that. I mean, I think the difficulty is that we need to create opportunities for people to create alternative institutions, alternative ways to and Gar, I think, has been working this obviously for. I mean, I was joking before we got on the air that I've met him years and years and years ago when I was reading his work, and And his work is fundamental because it is about building new institutions in which the capital and economic systems can be structured so that the ideology of the market is in fact not the ideology that the neoliberal ideology that governs the way in which we judge whether or not a market works. But one of the things you have to ask is, for whom are our markets working? And when we ask what are the public choices that we're making, we need to be frank about those public choices. For example, when the anti-affirmative action initiative was passed in California, I think it was Proposition 209, one of the things that the people in California were feeling was that there were fewer opportunities for their children to go to college, to get higher education. That was a real thing they were feeling. They were actually feeling there was fewer opportunities. But what they didn't know, or what the average voter in California didn't know, was that also corresponded when at the exact same moment when California was spending more money on prisons and jails than all money spent on education, K through 16 in California at that time. So they had made a public choice to institutionalize people in prisons and jails as opposed to schools. So there was a restriction in educational opportunity, and people were feeling it. They were using the old scripts, however, to blame the wrong people. And there are people who are very willing to use those old scripts. And so when I talk about recognizing whose systems aren't working for, and then using that knowledge to figure out who your political allies are, that's what I'm talking about. Because if we had said, look, what we want to do is to say we don't want to put our young men and young women, but especially our young men, in jails. What we want to do is we want to make educational opportunities available for them. That's something that applies to not just to black and brown men and women, especially men, unfortunately, but to the white, poor white working class kids as well. And they deserve educational opportunities as well. I grew up in California, and when people ask me what my politics are, I often joke and say I'm a Pat Brown Democrat. And the reason I say I'm a Pat Brown Democrat is because Pat Brown's made a promise, basically, and that was that if you stayed in public education in California, you couldn't get a better education in the world, K through 16. Now, it would be great if every state in the country could make that promise to every child in every state. Mm.
Julie, you work in education, and you've been looking at the questions of efficiency along with desirability of some of these principles that you mentioned related to the new economy, principles of cooperation, sustainability, obviously. But tell us a little bit more about your research and what it suggests about how an economy might be built on some of those other principles.
Yeah, thanks. So we're looking at, you might call them new economy innovations. We're looking at nonprofits. So starting with education, there's a lot of free educational material now available online or at very, very low cost. There are schools out there that are trying to provide people with the equivalent of a good college education at a few cents on the dollar in terms of the cost by doing innovative things like not building buildings, but really focusing on the people-to-people connections or using digital technologies to keep things cheaper. We're looking at maker spaces, which are places where people are coming together to learn many of the skills that have been lost in this society, teaching people how to work with their hands again, both high-tech kinds of making skills, but also things like woodworking and welding and so forth, to create livelihoods that then are part of what Angela was talking about, pathways to new kinds of opportunities. We're also looking at some of the more mixed for-profit sharing and so-called sharing entities, and I know that word doesn't necessarily fit with what they're doing, but what some people think of as platform economies, so entities like Airbnb, for example, or platforms that allow people to sell their labor. But we're trying to figure out what are the progressive versions of these. So, for example, let's take home health care aides, a very low-paid and exploited, very, very essential kind of work in this country. Many of them who work privately have to pay a hefty fee to the agencies which place them. Well, what if those workers now had a platform that guaranteed their reputations, put their ratings up there in the way that you do on something like Airbnb, and were able to place that platform owned by its users was able to place people in jobs and took only 3% rather than, say, the 50% or the 40% an agency might take. So we're looking at these digitally enabled kinds of economies where the technology allows you to crowdsource information, where you get a lot of efficiencies from the technology. But if you put in a radically different governance and ownership structure, you can create widespread wealth, you can create real person-to-person economies, you can give people access to goods and services if they don't have a lot of cash. That's what time banks do. Those are another kind of economy we're studying. So we're seeing a proliferation of all these things, and I think they are building blocks of a new kind of system, which is based on low carbon production and consumption. It's based on social justice, and it's based also on economic efficiency, because we need more than just the right principles. We need to marry the right principles with a system that actually works.
Thanks, Juliet. I want to remind everyone we're discussing this report, this challenge, really, for a conversation, the Next System Project, New Political Economic Possibilities for the 21st Century. LaunchTheNextSystem.org is the website. And if you want to pose your questions, do on Twitter at hashtagging what's next. Before we get back into the question of how does any of this change get made, Gar, I wanted you to talk a little bit about following what Julie said about what's possible and efficiency and power. I learned from the Next System Project report that you and Gus co-authored just how many states around the country have public banks today, and also how many cities are, as it were, renationalizing or trying to their public utilities, making them really public. Can you talk about that?
Well, it's exactly the same point that's going on. First, there is very little report. I think it's an important point to understand. Most newspapers no longer report local and state activities at any great length. First, they don't want to, and secondly, they don't have the staff to do it. So a lot of this is going on under the radar, but it's really expanding. A website called community-wealth, with the dash in, .org, covers this, and I just want to mention that because it's hard for people to understand how much is going on if you don't have the knowledge. But there are 20 states have had legislation introduced to establish a socialist bank, if you like, publicly owned bank. The classic one, the most advanced one, of course, is almost 100 years old in an extremely conservative state of North Dakota. And it is operating, making profits for the state, supporting co-ops, supporting small business, very successful model. And other states are trying to do that. There are a number of cities now with the same idea. Cities have tax revenues. Where do they deposit it? They can deposit it in a bank that takes it off to Wall Street and invests it, or they can deposit it in a local credit union. Or, in many cases, Santa Fe is one, Philadelphia is another, they're exploring setting up the new city-owned banks. And why not? Then to reinvest in the kind of co-ops we're talking about. Again, under the radar, there's a lot of this going on as well. So what you're beginning to see is this groundswell. Some of the kinds of advanced new technology things that Julie's talking about, some very local developments using existing technologies, but there is a movement that has not been covered by the press that is very, very impressive. And what's driving it is a sense, and this is the really important thing, a sense that's growing that something's got to change. And people saying, if they're not going to change it in Washington, we're going to have to roll up our sleeves and begin now. That's the striking moment for us. We've been involved in the Next System project. You know, 5,000 people signed up almost immediately saying that's what we agree with. And many, many different range, activists, scholars, the president of the Academy of Management, 2 presidents of the American Political Science Association, Robert Reich, former Secretary of Labor, a number of people beginning to say, we're not alone in this judgment that there's something profoundly wrong, and there are things going on at the grassroots level that lay groundwork which we can begin to see a new direction that is different from the old system. One last thing. In one sense, and I sometimes say this and people kind of laugh, I say we don't have any economic problems at all. Now what does that mean? The current economy is producing $200,000 for every family of 4. 200,000 for every family of 4 if you divided it equally. Now, we're not going to divide it equally tomorrow. But that is to say, this economy is extremely rich. We have a political problem and an institutional problem managing the wealthiest economy in the history of the world, and the economy that could be equitable all around and could be ecologically sustainable if we actually got serious about building a new system in the direction that's beginning to emerge throughout the grassroots level.
Well, then I want to come back to you, Angela, on this question, because you mentioned in passing that we have had better systems. I'm thinking of an era where, you know, public banks weren't so radical a thought, even publicly owned utilities, not so radical a thought. You said we've had better systems in the past, but they were undermined by lack of inclusion, by racism. Can you tell us a little bit more? Give us a few more examples?
Well, I actually wanted to pick up on the examples that we've just been talking about in terms of the new economy, the sharing economy, the maker economy, in terms of the banking that Gar was talking about. I would love to see us, as we create a new system, and I'm optimistic that we can, the moment for something drastically different is upon us. I would like to see us embrace the notion that the new system is not worth being proud of if it doesn't deal with the way that people have been systematically excluded in this society based on race and ethnicity, and to bring that as a litmus test about whether the new is new enough. So that when I look at the sharing economy, it doesn't help to have people just have a gig if the gig doesn't provide the kind of pathways to careers, if the gig doesn't provide the kind of support that people need. It doesn't help for us to have a new form of banking if people of color still can't get loans for the businesses that they want to start. So I believe that we're bringing forward examples of things that have to be in the next system. And I would love to see us have a conversation about how we bake in real inclusion, how we use a litmus test for inclusion so that we don't have to come back to this moment and do new again. When I look back at the things that happened after the Great Depression in this country and all of the new systems that were put in place to provide opportunities for home ownership, for retirement, for so many things, if people of color hadn't been systematically excluded from that, we might have gotten to a place where we wouldn't be quite in the crisis that we're in now. I actually have a theory. I have a theory that if you solve problems from the viewpoint and for the benefit of people who are most vulnerable, you solve them for everyone. If you solve them at the top or you solve them in the middle, you are destined to come back and have to do it again. And so I want us to figure out, as we're developing the new system, how to be able to bring that litmus test for equity and inclusion so that we're solving from those who are most vulnerable out and not coming back trying to figure out how to make up for the fact that we didn't get everybody the first time.
Gus, to you, picture of a trickle-up justice system, trickle-up justice, trickle-up economics. How do we move that forward?
Well, I think one key factor that I think is going to play a big role in the future are the oncoming crises that we will surely experience. And moving forward, to me, involves in part being crisis ready, being ready with the ideas already in place, so that we're not to put ideas on the table after the crisis already starts. But we've got constituencies moving forward with ideas for deep change. and having in place examples of a world that we would like to see being born in our communities already, so that when the crises do come, and whether they're economic or environmental or both, we can look around and see the world that we would like to build, and they're real. And seeing is believing. And I think back to something that Gerald said earlier. We do need desperately a new political reality, and the beginning of that is what my old mentor Charlie Reich called a new consciousness. I mean, we need to build and secure a consciousness that begins to see these problems as systemic. If we get ready for these crises, which will surely come, we can take advantage of them. But if we wait, we'll be swept away again.
Well, I want to get us, we're going to start taking questions quite soon, but I guess I want to push back just a little in the sense that many communities, many places in this country and in our world aren't just crisis ready, they're mid-crisis and have been for a very long time. And we see initiatives coming out of the South around cooperative farming and cooperative economics. We saw the initiative around Mayor Chokwe Lumumba in Jackson, Mississippi. We see the work on reservations. We see what's happening in Alaska in indigenous communities fighting global warming. And yet, we have yet to develop in this country any political expression that is engaged with those initiatives. We have a lot of politicians that talk about what's wrong, but unlike European parties, I'm thinking right now of Syriza or Podemos in Greece and in Spain, who are intimately on a daily basis connected with their country's solidarity economics movement, and whose politicians were out there providing services at the co-op and free legal and political advice. That's what I'm not. I think we have yet to build that. Am I missing it? I'm really searching. Gar.
No, I think you're absolutely right. This has not yet achieved a political expression. What we're beginning, and again, I think of it as historical development. My heroes, and I often say this, and I've written this in many places, my heroes are the civil rights workers in Mississippi in the 1930s and 40s who laid groundwork. You never heard of most of the people. Many of them lost their lives. They're the people who took these stands early and began building. But I think Angela's right. Unless you can combine that with a whole economic structure from the bottom up, it isn't going to happen. We haven't got to the political side of this, although we are reaching, I think, an opening where people are beginning to talk about this in a different way. People have not been talking about changing the system. We are talking about changing the system. And we're finding lots of people understand that language. That's a preliminary. These experiments that are going on, many of them in black communities, and some of them on Indian reservations. We're beginning to see experiments. We're seeing environmental experiments. That has to crystallize into a political form. It hasn't yet. At some states, Washington and Oregon, we're seeing politicians putting through legislation politically for banks, trying to in any case. We haven't yet got to that point. But if the development keeps on, and if people are willing to stand up and say, let's do it, I think that's how you build the politics over time. It is not a process for instant gratification politics. It is laying down the groundwork step by step and getting serious about a new direction.
Well, we like things that begin, middle, end, and by about next Wednesday. So we have some challenges, and we have some questions coming in from the audience, but I want to give Julie and Gerald, if you want to weigh in again, please do. One thing I think, Julie, you've talked a lot about the culture. You've written a lot about the culture. We have an immediate gratification culture, and we also have a culture that likes quick stories. Economic change is not a quick story. Maybe one product, one new green thing is a quick story, but economic systems change is a hard story for us in the media to cover.
Yeah, what I do think is possible in terms of addressing that is really a shift from a sort of consumer mentality to both a producer and activist kind of mentality that we're certainly seeing in a lot of the new economy initiatives. People really taking up the idea that they can shape their own lives and that they can make things and do things, and so it's a very different mentality than the buying instant gratification mentality. But I want to return to Angela's point, which I think is a really important one. I also share that theory of hers that by starting with vulnerable communities, you can build systems that work for everyone. And one of the things we're studying in our work on the sharing economy is the ways in which patterns of exclusion and both racial, gender, class exclusion are getting reproduced in some of these. And so, I mean, that's not a surprise. I mean, those are very persistent structural features of our economy. But there are, Angela talked about baking things in. To me, one of the intriguing things about some of the sort of digital innovations is that you can use the technology to bake in and out. So, for example, you can look at the pattern of access and behavior that people have on these platforms, and if you see patterns of racial discrimination, for example, you can address that, and if you build those principles into your platform, into the information gathering that you're doing, into the matching that you do in the platform, into the incentives that you build in, and so forth, you can actually take very powerful steps to say, no, we're not going to let the people active on this platform say no to guests who don't share their race, for example, or whatever it is. They're actually sort of new ways of addressing some of these long-standing problems of discrimination that nobody's talking about yet, but actually that I think as we talk about this larger conversation of race and inequality, we then can direct that to the specifics of, okay, so how is this particular, this kind of particular digital platform working? The same way we do for the non-digital.
We should just flag here, and Julie, you referenced at the very beginning that sharing economy as commonly understood is not mostly what you're talking about. There are a lot of institutions that call themselves sharing economy, like Uber and Lyft and so on, who are sharing a lot of other people's assets and time and resources and not sharing very much of the power and the profits proportionally. That's not what we're talking about, I don't think, right? And if you want to find out more about that, people on the webinar, I do encourage you to go and listen to the very excellent Baravi Desai of the Taxi Workers Alliance, laying out her critique of Uber's operations on our program not so long ago. So quickly, a couple of questions around policy. Are there specific policies, specific laws that you think could be changed here or passed here that would facilitate the kind of initiatives, maybe not at the macro level yet, but even at the local level, that are achievable, kind of low-hanging fruit right now? Italy has very different laws and has a very different picture when it comes to how many cooperatives exist. Puerto Rico, I discovered recently, teaches its high school kids about cooperation as a required course. In Kenya, too, I believe, at the college level. And then there are, of course, different structures of law in many parts of the world having to do with banking and utilities, you name it. But are there specific laws? Gus, Gar, anybody want to weigh in on specific things that are low-hanging fruit that we could work to change right now? Gus.
Well, I will kick in. I think there's one that is available to us. That is a system of new indicators that move us beyond this GDP fetish. I mean, in Europe and elsewhere, there's a lot of ferment, a lot of development of new indicators. So people are looking at indicators of the things of human well-being, of life satisfaction, social well-being, political accomplishment. I mean, the U.S. is down at the bottom of the list of the OECD countries in real democracy today. And so we need a dashboard of new indicators that give us a real sense of what we should be striving for and how well we're doing in getting there. And this has a long history that goes back to the very early days when the GDP and the national accounts were created, and Simon Kuznets said, you know, we shouldn't put too much weight on these things. And yet today it's about the only thing that everybody in the capital believes in, and that is more GDP. It doesn't matter that it's bad GDP or good GDP, we just want more of it. And so I think it could get some momentum behind a system of new indicators and make a huge difference.
Gar, anything on your list?
Yeah, well, let me, I want to take one point. There's a really interesting thing about what's going on at the local level with these banks and existing worker co-ops and land trusts and all these different ways to build democratic ownership at the base level. And here's a little secret that is wide open for everybody to know. The American business community has filled state, local, and national government with laws to support business. The secret is a co-op is a business. And that all over the country, people are beginning to see that you can begin to use the existing structures, sometimes with fine-tuning, sometimes straight away, to build shared ownership structures using the existing programs in a new way. So that's a really important part. The other piece that's going on, and again, it can be programmatic. There can be laws that say do a certain percentage of this. That is purchasing by government, city, state, local, and federal government. We have a preferential treatment for small business, minority, also for changing ownership. In Cleveland and in many parts of the country now, getting these big anchor institutions, hospitals and universities, to use some of their purchasing power to buy from these kinds of structures, that all advances the ball. There are specific ways to get preferential treatment or changing the law to set up a city bank or a state bank. But you can actually use a lot of existing law to change the way in which we're actually going forward now on the ground. That's what's exciting about what's happening in many parts of the country just under the radar.
And do you have some examples of being able to hold those institutions to account? Again, going back to Baltimore, Johns Hopkins had promised many things to the community as it got public goods, public tax breaks and other benefits to advance and grow. And yet the people I spoke to said the first 7-Eleven that they opened in their new development didn't take food stamps, didn't take into account arts.
Well, that's where the politics has to come in. In some parts of the country, we're seeing universities and hospitals doing the right thing and expanding and showing what can be done. The politics of it has got to come up against the Johns Hopkins around the country that have been unwilling to do anything. It's time to do that. That's where we begin to build actually the relationship between institution building and political challenge. I think that's the next step that's going to come inevitably, and we can foster it and begin talking about it in new ways. That's what's exciting about this movement, this moment. There's so much going on that the local press isn't covering that's beginning to suggest the foundational direction of a new movement that's very serious indeed.
And I'll put in just 2 cents for a new media system as well.
Yes.
Enough said. Steve Bean had a question for Angela on Facebook. To what extent do you think systemic racism is rooted in the profit motive of the economic system?
Completely would be my answer. There's no question about that being true. And part of what is going on is that racial anxiety and fear that gets fanned so that the system continues to benefit the few. I mean, we've really got to figure out a way to shake some understanding into the American people that holding on to racial fear and anxiety is choking the nation. It is blinding people to the strategies that will be good for them. And to go back to what Gar was talking about, in local communities, we actually can begin to do something differently. You know, the whole movement around community benefits agreements, when public dollars are being spent, is a perfect place to be able to achieve these kind of innovations that we were talking about. When we're spending public dollars, we need to make sure it's for the benefit of the people. It is an opportunity to get anchor institutions to operate differently, to make sure that our decisions about where we're putting things, infrastructure investments, who's getting the jobs, how we break up the contracts so that cooperatives and others can really compete, that we have a country in which we continue to react to racial anxiety and fear that is unfounded and hurting everyone. Until we break out of this box of worrying about who's going to take something away, having to have somebody on the bottom, being afraid of the impact of living next to people who are racially and ethnically different, begrudging the spending of public dollars to be able to help those that we often have animosity towards. All of those things keep us from having a robust economy, keep us from creativity, keep us from being able to tap the potential of all.
Can we have these conversations without tackling another fear, which is the fear of words like socialism and communism and planning? Is that part of the problem here too? Several of the questions are related to that. Gerald.
Well, I think, you know, part of it is you can say, you can ask, what is government for? You can ask a really simple question, what is government for? And what government's for is to serve the needs of the people. So you take a city like Chattanooga, right, which needed to improve its internet access for its citizens. So what it did was to publicly fund, publicly wire its city, which now produces internet access speeds 50 times greater than the United States average. It's a publicly owned system providing internet access for its citizens. That is terribly threatening to companies, and it's been opposed now. I think in 22 states now have passed legislation prohibiting publicly owned internet providers. Now that's the kind of thing that people can mobilize to do. And once you get an internet infrastructure, especially at speeds like that, you can do the kinds of things that Julie suggested, that you can have greater access for the entire community, and the economy, it spurs greater economic activity, and it goes back to asking, look, if private companies aren't going to provide this service at a reasonable rate, then the citizens ought to be able to do through their government what governments have always been able to do. Look at the LBJ brought electricity to the hill country here in Texas, right? The Tennessee Valley Authority brought electricity to Tennessee. Chattanooga is just continuing in that vein. You know, the federal government made California bloom, right? Government can do things which people cannot do by themselves, and so we need to ask, what is government for? And not everything government does is bad. And people can come together. That is, after all that government is. People come together to do things together, right? And what you want to do is, when people, when they want to demonize that, they call it, you call it socialism, you call it liberalism, you call it big government, you start calling it names, right? As opposed to calling it what it is, which people acting together to do things that they want to have happen, make their lives better. And when you just say what it is, it's actually far less threatening. Let's say, let's pave roads. What about that? Well, wait a minute, but that's socialism too, isn't it?
In the spirit of being on the offensive, I've always thought we should, instead of talking about capitalism, talk about anti-societism, anti-socialism, and see what we could get in terms of progress. A question related to that, and maybe this is for you, Gar, is how do we break from the negative stereotypes of the welfare state, in quotes, to explore solutions like a universal basic income? Several people have asked about that.
So first, let me take on the socialist question. There's been a lot of poll data on this recently. People under 30 favor the word socialism over capitalism. And when you go into minorities, the favorability rate of the word socialism goes up. Now, that's very big change from when I was in college and brought up. There's a big change that it's not toxic anymore. So I agree with Gerald. There's a lot of things going on in the cities and the state that can be done. And so somebody's going to say socialism. And the answer is, let's get on with the work and stop the rhetoric. So that's how I would pose it. The most interesting part about a an income, guaranteed income, is if you go to the state of Alaska, where you find and here's where you get your socialism, in one of the most conservative states, run by some of the most conservative governors, Sarah Palin included. They take oil revenues. We've got a question about oil from environmental reasons, but people are guaranteed in one of the most conservative states income from the revenues of the oil. That is, state money goes directly as a matter of guarantee to every single citizen. Most people know this, or many people know this, but many don't. That's a guaranteed income. That's a socialist principle, if you like. And in fact, Sarah Palin increased the number. At the peak of it, I think it's about $2,000 for every person. That means a husband and wife and 3 kids gets $10,000 check from the government as a matter of guaranteed income. We're going to have to do that in a broader sense and begin building out the economy as we go forward based on those kinds of principles. So I think that's inevitable, and it needs to be public discussion, public demand. Why should it be that so much of our economic wealth and income goes to the very top? Top 1%'s gone from 10% to roughly 22% of the income. Why couldn't part of that just go out as a way of stabilizing jobs or income for other people? These are the kinds of questions that have to be put right on the table again and in an open and public discussion. And I think we're reaching the place where people are fed up and beginning to say, it's time for this conversation.
Angela, did you want to weigh in on that? Does anybody want to weigh in on this? Angela?
No, I agree.
Oh, okay.
No, I agree, totally.
There is a question out there that hasn't come up in our conversation here, which has to do with the militarization that I mentioned at the beginning. How do we accomplish systemic demilitarization is a question on the Twitter feed. Julie, you think you could answer that one?
Well, I do think that, this basic issue of one of my friends phrased it some years ago as, what's the economy for anyway? I mean, when we start to ask that question, it really can take us in a lot of good directions. And that's the question we have to ask about the military, too. What's the military for anyway? And I think that because it involves such an enormous amount of money, and it's so implicated in the financial possibilities of rebuilding our cities and providing a basic income and getting the education system, having that whole new construction of an education system that Angela is talking about. So I think that that's really key. We're not going to be able to move government money without talking about the military. That's one thing. But I do want to loop back to Gar's point about the trust fund in Alaska, the permanent fund, which is to say that I do think a key sort of linchpin of a new economy in terms of big policy changes is going to be to take the revenues generated by a tax on carbon polluters and dividend them out to the citizenry. That it's really central, because those we need a basic income, and with the growing technological unemployment that we're going to see in this country, in which more and more people's jobs are going to be automated away, we've got to have a way to give income to people, and which is going to be delinked from conventional kinds of sources increasingly over the decades, and we absolutely have to decarbonize. So those are bedrock principles of a new economy. Basic income, polluter pays.
Decarbonize, demilitarize. We should throw the prison industrial complex into this mix too. De-incarcerate.
Right.
What about the global picture? Gerald, do you want to talk about this? Can we accomplish any of what we're talking about in terms of systemic change without the rest of the world? Where's the internationalism in this picture?
Well, I'll talk about that in a second, but I do want to suggest a couple of things. One, when you talk about decarbonizing and you talk about demilitarizing, there's a couple of things I want to say first. First of all, when you think about the agricultural industry, decarbonizing the agricultural industry is actually going to be a major event, and moving forward in that and thinking about all of the changes that are happening in the ag industry in general, and taking the carbon, reducing the carbon footprint of the ag industry is going to be really important. There's actually, when you think about the government departments that are the greenest, in fact, it's the military that is probably the greenest. And there are technologies from the Defense Department that we ought to be able to take and put to civilian use that would actually reduce the energy uses that we're making in the civilian economy. And because the military knows that its dependence on normal energy sources is a matter of life and death in supply chains. So it's already making green choices for maybe the wrong reasons, but the reasons it's making it is because it's a matter of life and death for its troops. So we ought to, as we move forward to demilitarize, we got to take the stuff that the military has already developed, the technologies they've already developed, the things they've already learned, and pull that into the private economy, just like we did for the internet, which was of course developed for military purposes. Obviously, internationally, when you think about decarbonizing and reducing the overall carbon footprint, and Juliet's point about taxing the carbon and then spreading the wealth of the carbon tax, I'm at 100% in agreement with that. I'll have to send you Who Owns the Sky at some point, because it belongs to all of us, obviously, and we can't just shift our burden overseas. The debate we're having now about the fast track agreement that the president wants is precisely about shifting burdens and then bringing those burdens back home, and we ought to have that debate as well. So when we talk about the next system, part of the next system involves, of course, the internationalization of the system. And although a lot of the stuff we've been talking about is local and domestic, it's obviously tied into networks international networks, and both energy and agricultural networks.
Angela, go ahead.
I do think it is so important in talking about the next system to integrate the global with the domestic. We separate those things too much, and the American people fall again into fear and anxiety, and by thinking that somehow they need to be against things that actually they don't understand. And so we need to routinely help everybody to understand how this global system is placing people at a disadvantage in this country and in other countries. They need to understand the interrelationship. So I think it is so important to begin to talk about the system in the global context so that people see what the real relationships are and how everybody often gets harmed because we are pitting one racial group against another, one class against another, one geographic area against another.
I want to take a moment just to remind people. Thank you, Angela. Oh, Gus, did you want to come in on that? Go for it.
Just to point out that in terms of the international context, we are the great foot dragger in the world. I think much of the world, and probably most of the world, would put up a loud cheer if we started moving seriously in the direction of the systemic change we're talking about. And along these lines, and back to the word socialism, I mean, we have so much to learn from European the social democracy in Europe, with pioneered sophisticated healthcare systems, family welfare systems, free college education, like my Senator Bernie just proposed. So I think we have a lot to learn internationally.
Well, in that spirit, I want to ask Gar to remind people what they can do if they want to keep learning about the Next System project. There is a website, thenextsystem.org, where you can sign on to the statement that is at the heart of this project. I also want to remind everyone that today's webinar is sponsored by an amazing array of groups. It's being hosted there at the Institute for Policy Studies, but the New Economy Working Group, the New Economy Coalition, Bali, the Schumacher Center, the list is long of the people who've made today's event possible. I'll also just put a pitch out for Grit TV that we cover these issues pretty much on a weekly basis, and I've had most of these folks on the show. But Gar, two things. One, how can people stay involved? And then from everybody, I would love to go back to Angela's idea of a litmus test and ask for your everyone working on this. You should have been more interspecies about this whole thing. How do we tell a real change from a cosmetic change? How do we identify a systems change versus just a nice new green innovation? How do we recognize power shift as opposed to just a few more people getting a piece of the not very good pie that we're all chewing on? Any advice on those questions so that our considering of this huge array of subjects that falls under today's category of new economy can get a little smarter, can get a little more specific? Gar.
Well, a few points. First, we've mentioned the top 10%, the top 1% has gone from 10% of the income to 20%. That's a lot of money that could be available. Military, there's trillions there. And if you look at the healthcare system, we spend double roughly what other advanced countries do on a system that's half as bad. Another $1 trillion is available there. We are a very rich country. So number two, what can be done? Community-wealth, put the dash in, .org is a web page which will, blow your mind about how much is going on that can be done by anybody in any community. So that it's no longer possible to say that you can't take a start in your own community. And there's a lot of it is being done in very interesting ways, racially integrated, and starting at the bottom, Angela's point, building up from the bottom. There is work that can be done on that. It is no longer, the press doesn't cover it very well, but if you go to those websites, there are things to do, or if you go to the nextsystem.org, we're providing information on what's already available. So that's, I think, the basic way of looking at it. This is a rich country. There's a lot of waste going on. There's new technological possibilities of the kind that we've discussed today. This is not a time when people need to say, and I think this is the key problem. A lot of people are self-reinforcing pessimism rather than looking at how historical change actually occurs. The way it's done is a few people get together in a local community and they say, I'm not interested in the pessimism. Let's get a half a dozen of us together, start learning what can be done, and let's start acting here. That's how you build a movement. But the really important point is we're finding people all over the country who say, as we're saying today, they know that there's a systemic problem. Partly just talking about it is the first step, and the second step is figuring out what you can do locally on the basis of what other people have already shown can be done.
Gus?
Laura, to pursue your question about the touchstones of knowing whether we're dealing with a really systemic change or reform, I think there are two related things that are very important. One is, does the initiative move a larger and larger share of our economy off of the private motive? This is at the root of a lot of the evils that we confront, and so that would be one question to ask. Another question to ask is, who is making investment decisions in the society? Is it the local communities, or is it big banks? And today, the vast bulk of investment decisions are not democratically determined. They're determined on the basis of financial return. And we are missing out on huge opportunities for social returns and environmental returns in our investment decisions. So we need to find ways to democratize and the process of deciding where the money, what it is invested in. And if it moves towards that direction, then it's a good new economy initiative. Those would be two things to think about.
All right, Gerald? Oh, you're going to need to make your microphone. Gerald? Or Gerald, are you there?
Yes, I'm sorry. For some reason, my microphone has been muted. Is it? Am I on now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, when I think about the things that need to get done, I mean, part of it is, I mean, I agree with Gar that we do need a kind of optimism of the spirit, right? Because there is, and I confess to being an optimist, probably a pathological optimist, because I really do believe that change can happen. Change is happening, and I think I'm an optimist because I've seen change happen. But I also recognize, and when I was talking to my students in my class on social movements, and I learned this in my first job. I worked for Marion Edelman in Mississippi, and we litigated by day, and we had to organize by night. And as I said to my students, organizing's hard. Organizing's hard. You have to go out and you got to do it every day, and you have to talk to people, and sometimes you have to persuade people, even when you know that it's in their interest, and they know it's in their interest, but you got to convince them that that change can happen. Mm-hmm. And I think that we're in a period now when the capacity and I think the thing we're doing today is actually a great first step, because it is a way in which we can join hands across the country, mm-hmm. and make change, or at least initiate change, and we can take it back to our communities and build with people much younger than I who are going to make change happen.
Juliet, in the not-too-distant future, might we be having this conversation on a cooperatively owned and decided about and invested in platform as opposed to Google?
Oh, yes. I don't even think we need the distant future for that. So one other thing I want to throw out there is rule changes, because rule changes are often very powerful. The TPP is not about trade.
Trans-Pacific Partnership.
It's about rule changes, and it's about giving big multinational corporations the right to prevent those rule changes in countries around the world. And one of the things, unfortunately, in building the next system, we've also got to defend from further encroachment on the old system in the direction of concentration of power and control. But rule changes are really important, and they're often key for making those ownership changes. So I think that's, when you're thinking about, well, what are the changes that are really going to stick and have powerful impacts through the system? That's one category.
Angela, back to you and your litmus tests. I'm for them. Which ones are the most important?
We need a new mindset. We're not a poor country, and we need to stop acting like one. We need to really begin to think that corporations, the marketplace, government, all of our institutions need to serve the people, not the other way around. We need to care about each other and create a society in which all can reach their full potential. That requires us to ask who's being left behind, why, and how do we lead from that vantage point to make sure that all really means all.
I want to thank you all, who you've been incredible. That was Angela Glover Blackwell. You can find out more about her at PolicyLink. She was preceded by Juliet Schor, the author of many critically important books, The Overworked American, The Overspent American, and most recently, Plenitude. She teaches sociology at Boston College. Before her, Gerald Torres, who we can find at Cornell, where he's the Jane M.G. Foster Professor of Law, and our hosts, the co-authors of the Next System Project study that we're discussing today, Gus Speth at Vermont Law School and Gar Alperovitz at the Democracy Collaborative. I want to thank everybody at the Democracy Collaborative in particular for maintaining and continuing this conversation, constantly pushing it forward. The Institute for Policy Studies, again, for hosting us today, and everybody who has participated in our Twitter conversation. It continues. Long may this conversation continue at thenextsystem.org. And thanks.
Thank you.